Hi friends, and welcome to our Wicked cookie decorating class. The first thing I want you to do is lay out all of your icing color bags, and then we're going to start by massaging each of our bags by swishing it around with our fingers before cutting, or you can pinch and hold the back of the bag and swirl the bag around so that way we can incorporate the icing consistency. Icing color separation is a very normal thing, and so we want to make sure each bag is nice and incorporated. Then I want you to flatten the tip of each one of your bags, and you're going to take a pair of scissors, and I want you to drag the color out to the tip so you can visually see where you're going to cut. And I want you to be very conservative with your first initial cut, cutting as small across as possible and as straight across as possible. This is very, very important to executing good cookie decorating when you're first starting out. Then you're going to take a piece of parchment paper or a piece of napkin, and I want you to test out each one of your icing bags, making sure they're flowing very nice and smooth. There are no breaks. Then you have a disposable cookie scribe tool in your kit, and I want you to always use the fine point tip of your scribe tool, making sure you keep your tools nice and clean, as well as the icing bag colors. You can use the fold of your napkin to keep all of those tips nice and clean. We're going to start off with our Wicked cookie, and I'm going to have you start off with green, and you're going to follow that imprint or pre-design on your Wicked cookie, and you're just going to start by following the outline for Wicked. If you don't have that imprint or it's not visible anymore, what you can do is just follow my steps into achieving the same Wicked outlines. And what we're doing here is just outlining. Now, these are the black lines of a coloring page that designate where color is going to be filled in. What we want to do here is outline with very minimal pressure, making sure that we're slowing down for the curves and that we are stopping and resting our points between transitions. So notice how I rest my point between each stroke, and you always want to seal an outline shape. That way we know exactly where we're going to be coming in and flooding. That's the next word that I want to focus on. We always start with outlining, we always close our outlines, and then we go into flooding. Now flooding is going to come next, and it's when we fill that whole area with the same color in this instance, but it's completely up to you if you want to be switching colors. Just keep in mind that all of our icing bags are pre-measured, and so that means that be conservative with how much icing you're using so that way you have enough to finish your entire cookie set. So continue outlining each one of these letters, focusing on making sure that you're keeping them nice and snug. And then if you are noticing that your piping bag is flowing pretty heavily or pretty smoothly, two things could be happening. It could mean your icing bag cut was too large, or it could mean that you need to go back to remassaging. At this point, if there's a cut, you want to pinch that cut shut and you want to massage the back end of your icing bag. And then at any point that corners are seeming too small, you want to switch over to your scribe tool to make sure that you are getting the most control over your icing. So notice how now that I have outlined this area in green, I am going to be cutting my bag a little bit larger, not too large, just a little bit, so that way when I am flooding, it's going it is a lot smoother. I meant to flood this area. And so I'm coming back in with my green, and I am just squeezing probably 7 or 8 out of 10 pressure points to make sure that I am squeezing that exact area of thickness onto my outline. And so notice another thing here. When I squeeze, I am spiraling the tip of my icing bag as it's inserted into the area of flooding, and that always helps for smoothing out and really giving the appearance of a plump looking cookie. So I tend to notice that a lot of students are very afraid or nervous to squeeze a lot, thinking that it might just come outside of that borderline. Well, think about that outline as a protective line that helps with it not overflowing. And so it's actually pretty difficult to flood outside of these lines, especially for such a small surface. So I do advise you, if you're seeing a lot of imprint or texture, a lot of bumps and grooves in that flood, it's probably because you need a little bit more icing in that area. And so I really recommend that you try squeezing a little bit more icing to get a really nice finished look. Now, something that you could be doing right after you finish flooding is coming back in with your scribe tool and really pushing icing and extending it to those sharper corners, and also focusing on popping any air bubbles, keeping that tool nice and clean before you move on to your next cookie. So we're going to be finished with our Wicked lettering, and we're now going to be starting on our Wicked Witch of the West hat. We're going to be using black icing, and we're following that cookie imprint to outline this witch hat. Notice how there is an under layer of this hat and a top layer. We want to make sure that we create all of these different sections because we're going to be practicing flooding at different times. So this is a fun little technique and a very important one, because allowing for just a little bit of drying time on the same color allows for dimension and the effect of 3D, where we can actually feel and visually see the difference in the icing being flooded at different times. So it's a really cool technique that we're going to be doing here, but it does start off with outlining all the bases of our pieces in black. So we're going to go in and flood just that top portion of our hat, as well as the little tiny insert. We switch over. We're not going to be flooding all pieces that touch together. So notice how I flop around, I switch around to different areas that won't be touching one another. So we're going to be doing the cape part as well with that black. And we're going to continue trying that technique of insert and spiraling the tip of our icing bag. So sometimes I want you to think about this. I'm not always squeezing my icing bag when you see me have it in my hand. Sometimes I'm using my icing bag as a scribe tool so that I don't have to pick up the scribe tool just to swirl icing around. Sometimes I just don't squeeze the back end of my icing bag, and all I'm using it for is swirling icing into place. So you could always do that as well. And that's a fun technique to keep on the back of your mind. I do like to switch back to my scribe tool at the end, but we're working with royal icing, and it does tend to dry quickly sometimes, especially if you're running your AC. So keep that in mind. And then be very careful with your cookies, but you can give it a cookie shake or a cookie tap on your surface where you're decorating. And that helps to instantly smooth out the texture on your cookie as well. So the insert of our hat is actually going to be in green, and then we are going to outline just part of her face and flood that in right away as well. And we also want to outline and flood her hand. And so we're going to be working on these small little sections. But when it's such a small little area, you could go right into just flooding it very rapidly. And then we're going to be switching over to our brown icing and doing the top portion of her ponytail, flooding that in, making sure that if we picked up any green, we wipe that off right away. Now we're going to be overextending and over-exaggerating all the curls in her hair, especially on the back side of it. So really work on exaggerating those curves so you can conserve them. And then you go into flooding them. So notice how I could actually squeeze and really exaggerate those curves or curls in her ponytail by pushing icing on each curve out towards the cookie border, and then I come in and flood it all in. So this is a nice looking, like we're working through all different portions of our cookie and we're having a good time. And that's like the main importance of cookie decorating, is that we're always having a good time. And then we are going to continue switching through colors. The big thing that I want you to focus on here is when your icing goes from very shiny to more of a matte finish, that's when you have the green thumbs to continue working through flooding at different increment times. And so we then move on to flooding the rest of her dress. I did focus on flooding the sleeve first because I want to make sure I retain that shape. And then I work towards the bottom part of her dress. And I always really try to slow down with my corners, and then I could work faster filling it in a maze-like pattern as you saw here, where I'm just creating the border and then working on the middle section before switching to my scribe tool, pushing icing around to even it up. You can give your cookie a nice side glance. If you look at it, tilt your head to the side, you can see where you're needing to flood icing into, because it becomes a very visible thing that you can see with the icing reflection. So our hat has started to crust over at this point, and what we can do is take that black. You want to be very, very careful not to stab your black onto the cookie because it's still very fresh, but we can start adding all those creases with black onto our hat. And our cape is looking more of a matte finish as well. So now we can add the highlights over her cape. We're just adding a series of different length lines on the cape on top, and when it dries it will be a dimension added on top. I know it's so difficult to see black on this cookie. Black on black is never fun or easy to see, but the last part I want you to flood is going to be her neckline, which is attached to the cape. And you can add as many lines as you'd like to. I also want you to re-outline that sleeve on her dress so that really pops out as well. And then you have your first finish Elphaba cookie. Good job, everybody. Now we're moving on to our Glenda cookie, and we are going to be taking white icing and we're going to be working on outlining her crown. And so you want to close it off all the way and then start on flooding it. Notice how it's never too late at outline process to continue extending all of those different points. You can switch over to your scribe tool if you really want to make them nice and pointy, but I still continue using the end of my scribe tool sometimes to really create that pattern. Now we're going to start working on her hair. We're going to switch over to yellow, our yellow piping bag, and we are going to start working on her hair. So notice how I did the half part section of her hair first before outlining and flooding the remainder part of her beautiful hair. And so we're going to be flooding this section right away and just spiraling the tip of our icing bag to get it nice and smooth. Remember that squeezing more icing into these areas elevates it and gives it the appearance of a nice plump finished cookie. And so I like to practice working from top to bottom. And so I am now switching over to my skin tone color, tan, and I am going to outline and flood her whole head shape, extending that nose out. And then I move on to continuing to outline her neckline, her chest, and her arm. Now, when I'm piping her fingers, I do pump out a tiny dot of icing for the thumb, and then you could do a deeper pressure point for the rest of her hands before continuing to outline the rest of her body. And you do want to close off this entire outline so that way your skin tone does not blend in with your hair color. And then you flood the entire space in. And now we're going to switch over to our pink icing bag, and we are going to outline and start working on her beautiful, stunning dress. This is probably one of my favorite cookies in the whole set, just because I love all the different ruffles. But we're going to start outlining each part of her dress. And remember that it's very important to create these protective outlines to protect them from the color blending in from something as super bright as the pink onto that skin tone. And so continue outlining each section of her dress, each little ruffle, because we're going to be flooding them at different times to really retain the effect and appearance of how pretty this dress is in the movie. And then we're going to be working on adding what is my favorite part is all the glimmers and all the little fine, tiny details that come on her sparkly dress. So when you're ready with all of your outlines, I want you to take that same pink and I want you to add more pressure when you're start pumping icing into these different sections and start by flooding them. Remember that our goal here is that we're going to skip around and add icing to different sections of it at different times by waiting for it to dry a little bit, just like we had done before on earlier cookies with Elphaba. And so we are leaving that second row of ruffles free and empty, and we're switching over to that bottom layer, flooding that in, making sure you're slowing down on different areas using your scribe tool if you need to, but all we're doing is hopping around. This will take a couple tries to come back to and flood as these areas start to crust over, but we could go back to the very beginning and start working on her hair texture, because the hair has become more of a matte finish. So taking that same yellow color, we're starting to add the texture in her hair. And so you can add as many as you want, but I am going to be adding the curls on top of the blonde hair and creating all of the fine details to really bring her hair to life. So feel free to add as many as you'd like here. And then we're going to be starting the first look into the glimmer. So notice how I squeezed a glob of white icing onto her dress, and then I take my clean scribe tool and I extend the points top, bottom, side to side, and be very careful not to add too much pressure so that way it doesn't go into or break apart our pink icing. And then I like to add a series of a couple of dots. I like to switch out the shape of my stars. So be super creative, have a lot of fun with this. This is supposed to be a really fun cookie also to decorate. All of our cookies are fun, right? We add a lot of fun details to each one of our cookies, but I do want you to take your time. The purpose of pre-decorated videos is that you can pause at any point and just slow down once you know what you're supposed to be doing, or learning different tips and tricks. Then you can kind of start working on your own and improvising it as need be, because all of these cookies are yours. And I always like to see the finished work at the end to see we started with the same colors, the same cookies, but our works are always so different. You can tell because you are your own artist. And that's my favorite part of cookie decorating, is seeing all the different creations my students create. So now you keep working through all of your different sections and flooding the rest of those sections on your cookie. And then you continue to go back and cycle all of the different glimmers with your white. And so once we have our whole ruffled dress flooded, we come in with white and add all those different arrays of glimmers. So the tiny dots, the big cluster star, and then the 5-point star, which is a cross with an X in the middle. And then you decide how many of these you want to add. Just have fun with it. And then that is our finished Glenda cookie. So our last cookie is now going to be our castle, really fun and pretty cookie. And we're going to be starting off with our green, following that imprint on our castle that we have on the cookie. And if you remember, if that baked away or wasn't so visible, you could just follow this reference for yourself or create your own. And you want to close off that whole space outline, and you want to then go into flooding. Really slow down when you get to the corners and the points so they don't merge and create a big glob. So really focus on slowing down on the tinier portions of flooding. But you want to flood in your entire castle in green. And then we're going to switch over to our black icing color. And we're going to start outlining the castle again to not lose any of that shape. And then we're going to continue outlining the exterior shape of our cookie. So that way we create a border that we can visually see of where we need to flood in all black. And then work on flooding that entire section in, so that way we can start adding our fun details, which is going to be our trees. And because this is your final cookie, I always say get really creative with something else you want to add to it. Even with any of our other cookies, if you want to start adding some flowers or more glimmer, or I think even going back to Elphaba cookie, you could be using white on top of her black dress and add texture and dimension to that dress as well. I just always want you to kind of think about ways that what else can you be doing to your cookie, to really bring it to life in the way that you're having so much fun experimenting with your icing and different techniques, because this is how we learn, is by continuing to feel brave about going past what your instructor is telling you to do and kind of being a rule breaker in a sense of words, which is how this all got started. So now we're going to be, once we flood it in the background in black, we take our sprinkles and we start adding at random. I'm dropping white and pink sprinkles that's going to represent our blooms. And I love how organically fun this is to bring our cookie to life, because you really can't control how small all of these sprinkles are. They just naturally fall in place. But I love how this cookie is going to turn out. So add in your sprinkles, add as many or as little as you'd like. And then we are going to start working on our greenery. And so we're going to be taking our green icing again. And now we are creating a stem first. And then depending on the placement of where your sprinkles fell, you're kind of trying to map out where your tree is so that the blooms look like they're connected to your branches. So create each stem on each side of the cookie castle framing. And then you create branches that are strategically placed where your sprinkles fell. And so that's how this becomes really fun, is to see how where our sprinkles wanted to fall. And then you use filler space. So with filler space, we add some glimmers in green, and we continue to kind of map out our scene this way. And then take your green icing bag, and now we add thickness to that branch. You could come back in and squeeze more icing into the stem of your trees to really define branches and stem. But look how pretty it's already looking. And now we're going to be taking our pink icing bag, and we're not going to be filling in our road yet, but we are outlining everywhere but that, so all of the corners. And then we're going to flood in our field in pink. And so work on really pumping out icing into your corners, flooding in this entire space. On both sides, we want to be flooding in this area with pink. Remember that you can use your scribe tool to really push it into tighter quarters if you're needing to. And then spiraling your wrist and the tip of your icing bag to really settle the icing in. But I'm still needing cookie assistance to get really close to this little gap here. So that's what it's for, is when you're really needing an assist. Now we're going to switch over to green again, and now we're adding our grass strokes. So tiny little strokes of 3s is what I recommend, 1 tall in the middle, and then 2 little diagonal lines off to each side. And you'll notice how we're going to be adding little blooms at the top in white. So this is to represent our tulips. And what I do is I create 1 stem in the middle, 2 off to the side. Think of it as the letter W. That could also be giving you the shape of tulips if you just pipe out a W. And then this represents our flower field, which is so much fun and turning out so cute. And then the very last thing is going to be taking our yellow icing bag and piping out our yellow brick road. And so we're going to be highlighting this on top of the pink. So you can outline this directly on top of the pink and then going into flooding it right away. And then we are going to have our final finished cookie, which I have to say the set has just so much fun. All of these cookies are so special. You can place Elphaba and Glenda side by side, and they're intended to be holding hands and just really supporting one another. I love the movie. I love the story. I love these cookies. I hope you had so much fun cookie decorating with me today, and I can't wait to see your work. I continue to see you in class and hope that you continue learning with us. Have a beautiful day.